Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule to learn about a really important topic that research proves is crucial for your individual success, our collective success, and is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. Our mission at the Brown School of Professional Studies is to empower you, the professional learner, with the skills, networks, and tools that you need to transform the way the world works for good. And that is a mission that I am incredibly passionate about because every year there is a deluge of research that shows that the way that the world works now does not, in fact, work for the vast majority of us. In particular, there's an annual Gallup survey that surveys thousands of employees across sectors, and pretty consistently, including in the most recent report that was conducted in 2024, they find that about 75% of the US workforce reports being disengaged at work. Being disengaged at work leads to bigger mistakes, less innovation, less productivity, and worse mental and emotional health outcomes. So, this is actually a crucial but, and this is the good news, solvable problem. And so I thank each of you for being here today. I know it's hard to juggle all of the demands that we have on our lives, but I hope that I've convinced you that being here is crucial. And I'm so pleased that you chose to join us today to learn more about a skill set that will help you be one of those transformational leaders that will transform the way the world works for good. And so, to give you a little bit of an overview about how today's session will run, first, I'm going to play a recording from Jarvis Sam talking about the ROI of DEI work, but he will join us live for questions and answers. And so, we will get the main content of his presentation first. Then I'm going to give you a brief overview of a program that he designed and runs to help you have a pipeline into how to continue to learn from him. I feel pretty confident that once you hear from him, you'll want to continue your learning journey because I can't get enough either. And then we'll close with a live question and answer session with Jarvis. So, to give you a little bit of background about who Jarvis is incredible. He is our faculty lead and developer of the Applied Inclusive Leadership Strategies certificate at Brown. He got his executive MBA at Brown. He is a professor of the practice at Brown. And he has his own diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy practice called the Rainbow Disruption. Prior to striking out on his own, he was the chief diversity officer for Nike, where he was recognized as a Forbes 30 under 30 in the sports category in 2021 and a Portland Business Journal's 40 under 40. He is certainly someone to watch out for, and he is someone that I learn from every time and find to be truly one of the most engaging faculty members I have ever seen in action. And so, without any further ado, I would like to welcome Jarvis and to play his recording for you now. If you do have a question at any time, please ask it by clicking on your bottom bar of Zoom, clicking on Q&A and typing and submitting your questions there. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout. And so at the end, when Jarvis joins us live, that will help us to get through as many questions as possible. So please submit your question the moment you have it. So welcome and enjoy.
Much, Allison, I greatly appreciate it, and such an incredible pleasure to be connected with everybody that's joining us for today. Allison gave you a brief introduction to my background and some of the work that I do, but I cannot express enough how excited I am to now be entering our third cohort of practice with the Applied DEI certificate, which I'm thrilled for you to hear a little bit more about toward the end of our conversation. When we initially got together to develop this certificate, my goal was really threefold. One, to move leaders from theory and to actual practice and understanding how does diversity, equity, and inclusion come to life in meaningful ways. Second, to highlight to leaders, albeit what industry you work in, what function you serve, or your role within your company, what are the qualities and characteristics that enable diversity, equity, and inclusion to thrive through lenses like accountability, transparency, and visibility in our organizations. And third, to create an environment where a topic that in so many ways over the last 2 years has been rife with challenge, issue, misinformation, and distrust can better be understood through the lens of what it actually is and how we create stated commitments to doing just that. My approach to DEI is very different than a lot of what you likely see at your own company or institution, as well as in practice. You see in my work, I combine both my own academic pursuits and perspectives, where I, as a researcher, through my work for both my bachelor's thesis, my time at Brown getting my EMPA, as well as my work now as a professor of practice, centers around understanding how do we leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion to positively, productively, and efficiently shift the way in which we do business, centering beyond just team and talent or people and culture strategies, but truly helping us to recognize the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion on our bottom line, and the driving and fostering of business results. Throughout our time and tenure and going through the course, you will actually get direct exposure to how to do this work in practice across a variety of different lenses and spaces of impact. I talk about this as well in my text that I released last year with my first book, DEI Credential, where we outline for leaders what are the core strategies that are needed to make diversity, equity, and inclusion successful. And yet, with all of those thematic approaches in mind for the design of the course, we have embarked on such a challenging time and experience for how we navigate DEI at present. You see, according to research and statistics, in the last 6 months alone, negative sentiment surrounding the term diversity, equity, and inclusion at the social, academic, and corporate level has risen to an all-time high. More than experiences that we saw when the field of practice initially became into public light through the lens of the term DEI in the 1980s and 90s, even more than what we saw in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd. A large part of the reason why we're seeing such significant pushback is leaders have not felt the level of progress that they desired from our ability to enact diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies within our organization. A lot of it is informed and influenced by misinformation, flawed and fallacious reasoning, and a conflation of how diversity, equity, and inclusion programs work to drive meaningful social, economic, and environmental justice pursuits to change our companies overall. Today, we will explore how do we reset that agenda to realign where and how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be built in ways that feel sustained over time to support not only our consumer strategy, but also our employee strategy as well. We will do this by unpacking the lens of what I call the ROI of DEI. Let's jump right in with a bit of defining terms. Initially, part of the deep confusion that exists right now related to diversity, equity, and inclusion is that most people simply don't understand the essence of the term, or what practitioners like myself actually do. But why? In terms of the way DEI is actualized in society, it's often utilized to create changes around social and economic justice. It's utilized as a means to bridge and resolve some of the unfortunate and intrepid ills that communities experience around the world. From the long-term and long-standing impacts of deep historical moments, like periods of antebellum enslavement here in the United States, the long-term impact of the Holocaust, continued impact and implication of Islamophobia, global rights for movements for LGBTQ plus populations, the protection of women's reproductive rights, and so much more in society. DEI seeks to resolve many of those ills that issues, social pressures, and various isms and phobias like homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, ableism, and so much more have created. But as with most things, what starts in society has a very lascivious way of integrating itself into our modern workplaces. And so for multinational organizations, or even those only based here in the United States, we see the implication of what equitable workplaces look like. It doesn't create for an effective employee experience. It leaves consumers questioning if brands actually care about them. And what's worse, it oftentimes results in brands' inability to actually define who they are or what they value. As a result, we must redefine the terms to understand how DEI must show up in corporate to support our work and experience, beginning with diversity. Oftentimes, the term diversity is often understood as this area that exists in opposition to or separated from experiences of cisgender straight white men. Simply look at the way technology companies describe, define, or even measure some of their results. They describe diversity through the lens of LGBTQ plus representation, racialization for people of color, women, female identities, being a gendered minority. What this does is it creates a gap or separation, implying that some individuals are diverse while others are not. But therein lies a unique problem. Diversity, by definition, truly is the amalgamation of all of the various experiences, perspectives, thoughts, and approaches that each of us brings into a conversation or an environment that makes each and every one of us unique. What this implies is that the diversity paradigm must include everyone. We'll then jump to inclusion before coming back to equity. Inclusion, then, is the work that we do to develop cultural sentiments within and around our organizations to ensure that these various voices are elevated, heard, and felt in meaningful ways. It's closely connected to the way in which we build a sense of belonging by indicting our people, processes, systems, and approaches to bring communities together. But I know what you're probably thinking right now. Well, Jarvis, aren't you evangelizing an agenda that would seem to imply this lens or concept of hashtag all lives matter? Well, quite the contrary. What I'm saying is that to do quality DEI work effectively, we have to include and ensure that all voices are there. Put simply, cisgendered straight white men represent the majority of hiring managers, corporate executives, and people leaders within our organizations. Recognizing where they exist in the paradigm has to be a part of that conversation. Otherwise, we absolve them from any responsibility to drive, advocate, and be activists for the communities that exist in oppressed or marginalized spaces, and thus enter equity. Equity as a philosophy, when distinguished from equality, argues that we cannot simply hand out the same type of resourcing for every individual the exact same way in every community without due consideration of their own background or experience. You see, for all of us on this call, we hold various different identities that impact the way in which we navigate society, how society sees us, and vice versa. The philosophy of equity, on the other hand, argues that we must consider the needs of specific individuals, groups, and populations to better support and serve them. But what's more, it also forces us to consider where we have been complicit with the marginalization of certain communities. A conversation that many corporations simply don't want to have. Take a look at the footwear and apparel industry, for example. For many companies, whether Nike, Adidas, Reebok, Puma, they were built, led, and continue to survive because of the long-term and long-standing impact of Black communities. The connection, for example, between hip-hop and rap culture and footwear, particularly streetwear, is so closely tied and closely aligned that to not consider where we have been complicit in either lack of support and by extension marginalization of those communities does an inequitable disservice to communities in general. So when we put it together, everybody, the work of a diversity and inclusion practitioner is this. It's to create and define right processes, policies, practice, and systems within our organizations to recreate and define new strategies that allows for us to create opportunity and access to communities who have oftentimes been silenced or left out of equitable abilities to engage in our organization. So when people argue, well, DEI work is just reverse discrimination, or it actually is a unique form of racism, you can quickly see that's not true. Diversity, equity, and inclusion actually is not saying that anybody's voice should be left out or not included. It's saying that where we have power, control, privilege, and our ability to increase or amplify experiences of others, we have an obligation to do just that. So as we jump into the ROI of DEI, we will consider it with those definitions established on 3 key levels. First and foremost, we'll take a look at the financial impact connected to the ROI of DEI. Second, we will consider the cultural and innovative impact of it. Before finally, looking at its ability to drive real and apparent social change through the lenses of our organizations. First, the financial impact of DEI is oftentimes the most understood through the lens of what's often called the business case for DEI, largely rooted in a lot of the work done by companies like McKinsey and Company, Bain, BCG, Accenture, and so many others, and released in publications like Harvard Business Review. The business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly from 2015, argues that for companies that see an investment in a survey of more than 400 global companies, companies that invest in DEI oftentimes see a 35 to 37% greater likelihood of financial outperformance than those that don't invest. What's more, they corroborated this work in 2018 when they discovered that, particularly for organizations who see increased representations in spaces and communities for women, they see about a 27 to 30% greater likelihood of financial outperformance when in leadership positions. What's more, about 35% to 37% greater likelihood when people of color are represented in leadership roles. The business case, though, sometimes conflated with the perspective, though, that simply putting diverse voices into certain seats or into the conversation does all the job. That could not be further from the truth. Our organizations have an obligation to move beyond just the construct of diversity or the measurement of representation for it to actually work. You see, creating an equitable and inclusive culture is the only way that we achieve some of the results that we desire. For example, you can put queer people of color into senior leadership roles within the organization, but if they don't have the autonomy to make decisions that affect things like product, strategy, team and talent approaches, or solutions management, their identities do not enable them to actually make or build real progress. It's the age-old construct of the idea that a seat at the table goes a long way, but a voice in the conversation is even more powerful. Research from Harvard Business School later went on to find that when organizations prioritize approaches to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their talent acquisition strategies, the impact is quite successful. For example, in their work and research on what is known as the one in the pool effect, they discovered that when a woman or a person of color enters an interview process and they are the only one from their identity group, 0% likelihood statistically and probabilistically of that person getting hired. Why? We engage in fundamental practice of tokenism, where that person is ultimately given a harder interview, particularly by people of the same sociological in-group, and thus it leads to a greater likelihood that we do not hire that person based on our perception of their performance in the moment. What they discovered, though, of when we add even one additional person, results in some game-changing impact for talent acquisition teams everywhere. What they found is that when we add 2 women to the pool, 79 times greater likelihood of hiring a woman. If you add more than one person of color, 193 times greater likelihood of hiring a person of color for the role. It implies that the ROI connected to DEI is quite strong when we make the investment, and the tangible outcomes and impact of it are seen in the results of organizations. It allows for organizations to do better marketing, where you can appeal to different segments and onboard new individuals who have historically not been engaged with your organization in meaningful ways. We see this all the time when companies are able to do true approaches to inclusive marketing and engage in the deep pockets, for example, that are often centered around the pink economy or access to capital for LGBTQ plus communities, able to tap into disability inclusion through the creation of new and accessible products, and creating approaches that understand the cultural nuances of communities of color in meaningful ways that don't force us to feel tokenized, as if we're being pandered to, or that exist outside of and beyond just our cultural and heritage months. The impact to revenue generation and profitability has been proven a number of times in the research and literature. And so one of the big areas that drive the ROI of DEI is connected to both understanding the business case and making the right strategic investments to hiring, promotion, and most importantly, retention of our talent to achieve some pretty successful outcomes. But retention cannot happen without considering or exploring the second area of the ROI of DEI, culture and innovation. The culture of our organizations is what drives meaning and impact through and through, but it must be a culture that's built on principles associated with belonging and driving a culture of community building and inclusion. But that requires us to have some pretty well established values for how we get there. You see, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs often exist in organizations to help them perform better and to correct some of the challenges that organizations have faced or built and how they've established process and practice before. The unfortunate reality is this: unconscious bias becomes so deeply embedded into organizational cultures that if unchecked, it becomes part of our process as standard and simply our way of doing work as an organization. Take, for example, the impact of things like tightrope bias. Sometimes also known as gender bias, tightrope bias argues that women in particular in workplaces find themselves walking a proverbial tightrope. Where on the one side, if she's too mild, meek, or eager, she's seen as lacking the skills or qualifications to be successful in management and leadership. Where on the flip side, if she demonstrates the exact same qualities as her male counterpart, she's often faced with coded language and people saying things like, she's aggressive, she's abrasive, or she's got sharp elbows. And so she spends time walking this proverbial tightrope, simply trying to maintain balance and to be liked, also as called likability bias, simply to survive the organizational culture. As research continues to demonstrate from groups like leanin.org in 2016, when women engage in conversations around performance, attribution bias plays out all too often. Where in their research study, 66% of respondents noted qualities or characteristics related to her performance directly tied to her personality. Wherein 66% of the time, they used terms like aggressive and abrasive when she demonstrated leadership qualities or characteristics. A statistic that is only at 1% for her male counterparts. Our organizations, to understand and fully inculcate the impact of the ROI of DEI, must understand what tenets our culture is built upon. A few of them that come to mind that are necessary to drive great progress include the following. First, transparency. As an organization, our approach to transparency is absolutely paramount, and we see this play out at a systemic level in a variety of different ways. One of the easiest areas to look at is pay and compensation. If we look at total rewards approaches, for example, we well know that according to research and continued literature, women in the United States on average make 82 cents to every $1 earned by her white male counterparts. Organizations then do a lot of work to try to correct these efforts and to resolve these ills to get us closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, something that's built upon when we think about pay transparency and pay equity. However, many of these organizations fail to consider her intersectional identities, where if they did so, they would realize that while on aggregate, women make 82 cents to every $1 earned by her white male counterparts, for Black women, that number is 63 cents. Native and Indigenous women, 60 cents, and Hispanic and Latino women, a staggering 55 cents. For our cultures to build meaning, we have to create everything secondly through the lens of intersectionality. While many companies will have global commitments to the increase and amplification of gender identity, if we fail to consider her experiences when she's a woman of color, when she's a queer woman, a trans woman, a woman who identifies as Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, or otherwise, we don't get the full understanding and impact of how she navigates the world, what challenges that means around how we culture build around her, and what barriers or obstacles we need to intentionally remove to ensure she can build a successful and meaningful career within our organization. When we control for bias and create opportunities where we build culturally competent leaders, where concepts like intersectionality are built, where transparency is so nascent to the essence of what we do, where visibility and accountability are par for course with our work, we create a cultural experience where people want to stay and be retained by the organization. When we describe the ROI of DEI in this space, it's directly connected to the impact of attrition. The cost to hire new talent back in after we've lost someone because of the impact of our culture continues to rise year over year. And with Gen Z by 2025 comprising more than 30% of our organization, how we think about a culture that is aligned to generational diversity It's absolutely key. But we cannot avoid or neglect innovation. Research studies continue to reveal diversity as a big driver to innovation revenue. Put simply, we think about our products differently when we have different communities engaged, invested, and involved in some of these conversations. Take, for example, the disability inclusion movement. While a lot of people hear terms like disability inclusion and immediately equate it to accessibility and accommodation, it's so much more than that. Take, for example, a real world example of the Nike Fly Ease product. While it was initially developed to create opportunity for individuals with disabilities, particularly those with physical disabilities like cerebral palsy, to still be able to engage in the wonderful power of sport, what the organization found is that the product ended up being incredibly useful for aging populations, for women experiencing maternity, for people with other temporary physical disabilities, like having knee surgery or hip surgery, for example, and so much more. The innovation revenue, based on the investment that was made and a stronger understanding of disability inclusion, has resulted in a bottom line impact for the organization by bringing in groups that weren't even considered, quite frankly, as part of the initial brief for our product. But it doesn't start or stop with consumer organizations. Think about the work of B2B companies, professional services firms, and otherwise. The more that we invest in diversity in developing truly innovative service products allows for us to engage consumer platforms and groups very differently, including other companies that might want to use or leverage our product in meaningful ways. My organization, for example, has developed a very powerful LMS system that allows for organizations to tap into more than 100 different pieces of content related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, from building accessible teams to understanding race and racism and so much more. I'm joining you today quite literally at a client's offsite where we are doing work in the platform. And one of the things that we've discovered is that for this work to be effective, we have to design it through the lens of all employees in mind, recognizing how people engage with digital products and digital platforms, what fair use looks like, and committing ourselves to fostering innovation to achieve the real ROI of our approach to DEI. Last but not least, we have to understand the real impact for how this work is driven. And I often say it starts with two S's and two M's. We have to ensure that our approaches are both systemic and scalable. You see, within our organizations, while diversity, equity, and inclusion is so often perceived as just in American construction, it extends far beyond the borders of this nation. You see, work done in 2016, for example, by Dr. Badagati Swaran and her team in India found that the impact of the caste system on the adolescent girl and her likelihood to pursue education as a means of driving economic mobility and economic autonomy plays out as she navigates workplace and workforce. With many organizations developing multinational outposts in countries in various parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, as well as significant investment being made by tech companies in India, it is imperative that we understand that a systemic and scaled approach must take into account geographic differences and the building of cultural competency and how we navigate some of these conversations all around the world. What's more, for those on the call that are joining us that work in academic institutions or academic environments, it is even more imperative that we think about this given the continued impact of things like student activism on our campus. We have to grow in our knowledge for how we serve and support them because students are coming from all forms and facets of the world and with totally different viewpoints and values. And so to create a truly systemic and scaled approach to be able to see the outcome of our multicultural services offices, or if your academic institution has an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to think through the lens of scale. Not how we solve for one to many, but how we solve for many to many. To create a deeply broadcasted approach to engaging in content, work, and practice. But next, to fully achieve the ROI of DEI, we have to go to the two M's, measurement and monitoring. It has often been said that what is measured gets done, and what's not, you have no data backing it to prove it. Measurement is absolutely critical in this space, folks. There is a lot of impact related to the return that organizations see on DEI, but while most of it we try to look for deeply quantitative elements to measure it, we too have to center our experiences on qualitative approaches as well. within your organization, if you don't do this already, launch employee engagement surveys, baseline for the company, and then benchmark against other similarly situated companies or competitors in the marketplace. This helps you to understand what general employee sentiment is, how people feel about the company, and what their approach to engagement looks like. But what's more, leading organizations often carve out a series of questions, typically between 5 and 8, that is known as the inclusion index of the company, featuring a series of questions specifically focused on how employees perceive the organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The inclusion index allows us to understand, as we grow over time, how do we more effectively reflect opportunities for investment in representation, community building, and professional development for folks to drive meaningful connection to people to facilitate some of the outcomes that we want or desire to happen. That's just one element that you can do to effectively measure results. Monitoring is all about goal setting. As we look to set 3 to 5 year goals for our organization and try to foster long-term success and impact while also getting some short-term wins, it's important that we recognize what's working, what's not working, and where opportunities for further development exist. Having a clear pathway for how we monitor this along the way creates effective opportunities where systemic change can actually happen and be reached, and where, as an organization, we see the true impact connected to this work. Overall, the ROI for DEI is quite strong. Within your organization, it is imperative that we tie our DEI strategies as close as possible to our team and talent strategy and our corporate growth strategy as an organization. This is where we start to align where and how goals are built and drive great and progressive impact. To do that, don't forget to redefine the terms. This enables us to avoid some of the noise that exists in the broad ecosystem right now of how we talk about it. It allows us to tear through the fallacy associated with the current atmosphere and in avoidance of the current zeitgeist related to it. Define the terms in terms of how our organization wants to build and rescope this one. From there, remember the 3 core tenets of building the ROI of DEI. A focus on that business case and financial outcome, impact, and improvement. Committing ourselves to cultures of communities and belonging and recognizing the impact on innovation and innovation revenue. And finally, obsess the approach to building systemic solutions that prioritize scale and systems change, as well as measurement and monitoring. If you do these tasks along the way, and I by no means am arguing are they simple, but if you do these along the way and take a deeply practical approach to bridging the connection between theory into the real work, your organization will not only see amazing benefits, but be able to report out on the real impact of the ROI of DEI. I want to thank you all so much for joining for this mini lecture today. Please don't forget, if you have any questions about the topic that we covered, as well as Allison goes through some of the more details about the program, please feel free to use that Q&A function, as we definitely want to hear from you. And this is just a snippet of the type of work that we cover as you go through the certification process of the Applied DEI certificate. We focus heavily on how to make this real within your organization and how to add meaning. I hope that you enjoyed some of the nature of what we covered, and I certainly would look forward to welcoming each and every one of you to join us for the class. With that in mind, I'm happy to hand it back to Allison for our next step in our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. This was
Well, thank you so much, Jarvis, once again, for your incredible remarks. I think something that always stands out to me, and I've had the great joy of getting to learn from Jarvis several times, is that although the way that we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion may change over time in a way that may make the topic itself feel like a trend that is either in or out, the data is actually quite clear on how effective this tool is, both to our individual success in our careers and our success as leaders in team leadership, individual motivation, and in innovation and productivity. And that's why I am so glad that we have such an incredible leader who gets to help us to understand how to go from theory to actual practice, and why I'm so delighted to talk to you about how you can continue to learn from Jarvis if you are as inspired as I am and want to continue learning from him about best practices for inclusive leadership. So, I'm going to share a little bit of information about our program. And before I do want to encourage you once again that if you have a question, please click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on Q&A and type and submit your questions there, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. And we welcome all questions around both the messiness and the importance of the ROI of DEI and implementation best practices, and also about the program. So give me one moment to bring up my slides. As is always the case, they've disappeared the moment I needed them, but I'll find them. So Jarvis has already done an absolutely incredible job laying out the case for why this matters so much, but I wanted to back this up with some additional research. If we weren't showing you research, we wouldn't be Brown University. So the numbers paint a really compelling picture. According to Forbes, more diverse companies are 33% more profitable than their less diverse peers, all other factors being equal. In addition, the Harvard Business Review found that companies with the highest diversity, equity, and inclusion scores have a higher percent average ability to adapt to change. And that one particularly stands out to me right now because I feel like the year 2025 can be best characterized as a year of incredibly rapid change when it comes to the introduction of new technologies, new social norms, and new government regulation. And so, in order for any of us to survive and thrive in these current conditions, and adaptability to change is one of the most crucial leadership competencies. And there is a direct correlation between that and diversity, equity, and inclusion competencies. And lastly, according to the Boston Consulting Group, professionals who work for inclusive organizations report being 3 times happier than those who do not, which leads to much higher levels of retention and engagement and full participation, meaning you have better outcomes from those individuals. But, and there's a big but, 63 to 80% of employees reported to McKinsey that change is happening too slowly and they're feeling frustrated and disengaged. And in addition, as Jarvis mentioned, what gets measured gets done, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And CIO found that only 5% of organizations are holding executives accountable for racial and ethnic diversity in promotions, and only 7% for gender diversity. So we can see on the one hand how this is just an absolutely crucial skill for the well-being of organizations and teams, and also how there is still a huge opportunity to put this into practice in a more effective and systematic way. And we believe you're the right people to do that. So thank you for being here today. So we designed this program with 3 primary target audiences in mind. First, this program is for managers and leaders who are creating more inclusive and diverse teams and organizations. You're at the front line of people management and you want to make their experience even better. Secondly, this program is also for HR and DEI professionals, though I hope you saw with the first group that you don't have to be. Sometimes that's one of the number one questions people ask is if they have to be an HR and DEI. And typically we have a really strong mix of both people in the HR and DEI space and those who are not. And I think the program benefits from that mixture and from the shared experiences and shared wisdom of both sides. So you do not need to be, but if you are also welcome. And we typically have quite a few people who find their peers, who are developing and implementing the solutions at the company-wide level. And then lastly, just by showing up today, by raising your hand and saying that you're interested in this topic, this program is for you. And we've always had a really wide range of participants from different industries and different places in their career. So if you are ready to make a change within your sphere of influence, then this program is right for you. And so now I would love to give you an overview of what you can expect from the curriculum and the experience. So first, what you can expect is more learning opportunities from Jarvis. I really do think that's one of the highlights of this program is just how incredible he is. You got a taste of how engaging he is and how knowledgeable he is. And we really benefit from his expertise in the program. You've already met him, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions, but I will add that in addition to what you already got to know him as, prior to being on his own as the head of the Rainbow Disruption and prior to being the Chief Diversity Officer for Nike, he was the head of diversity and inclusion at Snap, the first ever. So he really established all of the diversity and inclusion practices. And prior to that, he worked at Google as a diversity program manager. So when you come into this program, you benefit from the best practices from all of these really renowned organizations who have been on the cutting edge since the very beginning. This program is a 6-week program, but it's primarily asynchronous, meaning you can work on it on your own time. We only expect about 2.5 hours of work per week, and that is split between a mixture of readings, watching pre-recorded videos, and submitting assignments and responding to forums. We've heard really good feedback about this mix because it gives you the opportunity to get to know your cohort really well, which I think is one of the best benefits of the program because your cohort connections outlast the formal end of the program. But it's also really doable. It fits into your busy lives very easily. And in addition, you get 3 live sessions on weeks 1, 3, and 6. So you get the best of both worlds, that feeling of being in a classroom and getting to ask your burning questions of Jarvis, and also the opportunity to do this at your own pace. So if, for example, you know that you're going to be on vacation on week 2, no worries, you'll have access to the full class from day 1. So you could complete your work for week 2 on week 1 or catch up when you get back on week 3. So we make this very flexible for you. The program is starting really, really soon. So there's actually only a couple days left to register, but we would love to have you be a part of this cohort. This is a snapshot of what the curriculum looks like, but I'll go into each unit in more depth. But what I love to point out here is that something that I think is really unique about this program, this was all under Jarvis's vision, is that unlike some other training programs in this realm, we spend very little time on vocabulary and theory, and instead we jump really quickly into competencies. So in week 1, we will do some level setting. Level setting is really important. But after that, each week focuses on you developing a really specific, tangible, and immediately usable competency. So like I said, in week 1, we do some level setting. This will be where you learn some crucial definitions and you'll analyze the benefits and challenges to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Week 2, you'll focus on cultural competency and inclusive communication. And this one has a specific focus on working on global teams and learning about some norms in different countries. Week 3, you learn to address implicit bias. And I love this unit because this one is helping you to identify and mitigate unconscious bias, and also how can you actually set the ground to prevent it in the future. So not just respond to it in the moment, but prevent it in the future in yourself and in others. Week 4 is on managing diversity and conflict. And this one helps you to both recognize when conflict is actually really healthy and productive and innovative, and also when it is unproductive. So you learn both strategies for facilitating the healthy conflict and also strategies for helping to resolve the unhealthy conflict. Week 5 is on promoting structural equity, which is one of my favorite units because I think this is missing from so many other curricula. And so we don't stop at the personal and the interpersonal level, but we also help you to identify and analyze your organization's current policies and practices that are at more of the systems level to see which of those are the ones that are helping people to thrive and are really inclusion productive, and which are the ones that are holding some people back without even noticing. It's usually invisible to most people. And this is also a unit where we focus a lot on data and metrics. So how are you going to analyze and measure what is and isn't working? And then lastly, in week 6, you bring it all together by learning how to lead for diversity and inclusion within your own sphere of influence. So in this week, you're going to learn some practices that really work, such as how to integrate and create employee resource groups. And you'll also develop, submit, and get individualized feedback on a personal level individual action project. And that is one of the hallmarks of this program, is that you're actually going to submit a plan for what you want to do, and you'll get feedback on it. But the plan is still relatively short, so please don't worry about the level of work that it takes, because we happily accept bullets and sentence fragments and early thoughts, but it helps you to move this content away from being theoretical and into being immediately applied and practical. And that's also something that you can tell your employer if you're looking to get employer support for this program, is that this is something that they can expect to see immediate outcomes from. By the end of the program, we commit to you the following outcomes. You'll develop effective, inclusive leadership initiatives by setting clear goals, creating an action plan, and tracking measurable success. Secondly, you'll learn to improve communication and collaboration across diverse teams by fostering an environment built on trust and respect. Third, you'll gain the leadership skills to navigate the complexities of diversity-related challenges and effectively manage and resolve conflicts. You'll identify and dismantle structural inequalities within your organization that hinder progress. And you'll promote a culture of continuous learning where curiosity thrives and new perspectives are embraced. And this also helps you to distribute the impact. So it's not just you who has left with these great skills, but you're going to be able to help influence your teams and your organization in order to create a way for this new knowledge to really proliferate and become the norm. So I hope you're convinced. I hope you want to enroll. And if that isn't convincing enough, one statistic that stands out to me is we have now run this upcoming cohort will be our 5th cohort. So we've run 4 cohorts, and from all 4 cohorts, 95% of our learners reported being able to immediately apply what they learned back at work, which is a statistic that I'm really, really proud of and is quite unusual. So that I hope that is motivating to you as well, and you choose to join us. Our enrollment deadline is on Friday. It is rapidly approaching, but to make it easier for you to join us, we are including a special promo code just for you. Think of it as a flash sale. So in the next 2 days, if you choose to join us and you use AIL, all caps, 15, the number 15, you will receive a 15% discount. The only step for you to enroll is to complete this really short enrollment form, and then you're in. And we will send all of this information out to you. You don't have to have any of this memorized. So thank you so much for coming. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Welcome Jarvis with us live and answer any of your questions. So if you have any questions, please put it in the bottom bar of your, click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on Q&A and type and submit your questions there. Hello, Jarvis. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us live.
Hi, Allison. It's great to see you as always. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So the first question that I see in our Q&A is asking you about the current climate. Can you talk a little bit about the current climate and what regulations, if any, are impacting individual organizations' ability to put these types of initiatives into practice?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Allison. I think for many of us over the last several years, we've seen a significant amount of social pushback connected to the work in DEI. And then obviously since January, as we saw an administration change with the executive branch, we've seen a lot more through the lens of numerous executive orders. We've seen this trickle down and in some cases see origination at the state and municipal level that's affecting many different topics that impact how we think and talk about considerations that are either directly or in some ways tangentially related to DEI. The impact on corporations and even academic institutions has really been twofold. One, it certainly instilled significant fear culture, where numerous organizations, in an attempt to avoid being put on watch list or even receiving direct threat or attack from the Department of Justice under Pam Bundy's leadership, have rolled back many efforts connected to their diversity, equity, and inclusion program. Some very notable examples that we see in the news include groups like Target Corporation, for example, obviously Harley Davidson. Cracker Barrel's been in the news a ton around some of their work in navigating this space and its realities. And then the second reason or second impact that we see is namely for organizations and academic institutions, this need to re-clarify or in some cases even relitigate approaches that they have established or built into their systems and processes around how they hire talent, how they admit students, how they think about approaches to promotion, retention, development, and the establishment of mentorship programs, for example, for specific talent from certain backgrounds. And so, Allison, it's created quite the conundrum that organizations are trying to find more effective solutions to effectively navigate. And I've spent a lot of time consulting businesses around how to navigate the current executive orders and think about the work really centers around how do we ensure compliance, namely from a legal lens, to not ruffle feathers unnecessarily with the Department of Justice and others, while also understanding, particularly for global or multinational institutions or for academic institutions who tend to recruit heavily from international or global marketplaces, remember that this is not just a US construct that we're navigating. Our work in the DEI space is truly global in nature. And while we have seen some rollback in the United States, it's actually galvanized many other nations around the world to actually double down on some of their approaches and commitments to try to foster real, effective, practical, and tangible solutions that work really well. And so, in my engagement with a lot of corporations, it's been finding that healthy balance between saying maybe we do have to change some nomenclature around how we talk about it in the org. Perhaps we do think differently about the way in which we built our established programs. But what's relevant to know is that while these executive orders have come out, executive orders aren't law, they're guidance. And so what's more significant is being mindful of what's coming out of the Supreme Court, the DOJ, and Congress around some of these topics and the tangible impact that that will have. But what we do know to be true is the provisions outlined, for example, in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 here in the States, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are still relevant, active, and the law. And so it's imperative that organizations are more thoughtful to not completely roll back programs and practices in the space because they could be setting themselves up for present and future risk around things like employee retention, civil litigation around the topic, so on and so forth. And so in this program, we definitely help give you as leaders insight into how to develop more practical approaches to navigate in a resilient manner some of the deep complexities that exist here.
Thank you so much. That was so insightful. I always learn from you in every single one of these. So I think this will likely be our last question. So this is also last call. So if you do have a burning question, please type and submit your question right now. But the last question that I see is, I lead a small team, but I am not a department manager or a leader of the whole organization. What can I do to make an impact?
Oh, I love this. I was on with a client very, very early this morning, around 6:30 Pacific time, and I shared with them there's a three-pronged approach that works really well in this space. We have to build solutions here systemically, interpersonally, and individually. First and foremost, a systemic solution is one that considers the ways in which our entire organization is established. It forces us to think about both the strategy and operations approach for the org. Whether somebody's a people manager in positional authority or leadership within the organization or an individual contributor, there is work that you can do to promote systemic change. For example, a lot of individual contributors may be tasked with joining interview panels for talent entering organizations. While the org may be waffling or making decisions on how they think about diversifying the talent pool or population, one thing that you can do to spark systemic change is to ensure that as you're thinking about your own biases that are both inherited and that you might be bringing into that interview room, intentionally checking those, making sure that there are elements within our system, both in how we collect feedback, distribute feedback, or engage with talent on the specific questions that we're asking, that it's not starting to reify a system that's rooted in things like affinity bias or confirmation bias to specifically challenge it on that level. Number two, interpersonally, our human to human interaction. Every single day, particularly in complex and highly polarizing times like this, we find ourselves navigating deep complexity with how we communicate, interact, and engage with folks within our workplace, our work environments. And that can be quite a challenge. I mean, be very clear. Over the last week alone, as we've seen significant polarization surrounding the assassination of Charlie Kirk, many individuals in corporate spaces and academic institutions have had to decide how, if, or when to use my voice. And we've seen a lot of downstream impact and implication of this. We've seen expulsion from academic institutions. We've seen arrest. We've seen terminations. And so this polarization can lead to significant fear. And so being very thoughtful about our interpersonal interactions, particularly if you're not a people manager, are key. But for those on the call that might be people managers, professors, or in an elevated role within an institution, the onus is actually higher. You have the burden or obligation of creating an inclusive environment or inclusive space for your team. And so how you create that interpersonal connection is even more significant. Finally, at the individual level, Allison, one thing that each and every one of us can do is just focus on continued education and development. In a world of hyperpolarization, we only succeed if we are able to distinguish signal from noise, fact from opinion or fiction, and understanding where we want to exist in terms of the right side of history in the future, and how we think about creating future ready practices and systems individually and for our organization. And so, committing yourself to continuous learning, programs like this, for example, help to really amplify what works versus what doesn't. It allows us to remove fodder because there is, quite frankly, a lot of fodder that's out there around what people should believe about DEI, what it is versus what it isn't, its impact, and how we measure it. And so, by going on that journey of continuous learning, investment in self, really helps us to drive that. So, put simply, systemically, interpersonally, and individually, each and every one of us, whether a people manager, executive leader, or an individual contributor, can actively work to advance principles of inclusive leadership.
Thank you so much. That was what I'm always like so struck by, and what I wanted to point out to this group, because I hope you all join us, is I feel like in every live session, you are so incredible at giving tangible tips that we can use right this moment and incorporating the most up-to-date news stories or controversies at times
Yeah.
right directly into the learnings. And
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful because I think that sometimes we as individuals might feel nervous to broach a topic that's that controversial, but that's where the best learning happens. And I
Yeah.
think you do such a good job of directly addressing this and tying in specific tangible strategies. So thank you so much for being here, for that incredible answer, and for the incredible way that you've put together this program. It's really special, and I hope everyone here chooses to join us for it because we'd love to have you.
I do as well, Allison. Thanks for that. Yeah, relevance is the way to succeed in this class. And I think, as you know well, every cohort has been extremely different, not only in terms of the composition of the class, but since designing this program together and actually building and driving it, the nature of the world has changed almost on an every 6 week basis. And so by the time we launch a new cohort, we really do focus on that relevance and impact for people and teams.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today and for your great questions. And I hope we get to see you in the virtual classroom starting next week. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.